INxx types detect misalignment before they can explain it. Ever paused in a conversation because something felt off, but you couldn't explain why? If you're an INTJ, INFJ, INFP, or INTP, that moment probably has a cognitive reason. Your mind detected the inconsistency before your words did. You're in the middle of a conversation. Nothing dramatic is happening. Someone is telling a story. Their voice is calm. The sentences make sense. Everyone around you keeps listening. Then, halfway through the sentence, something shifts. You pause, not visibly. The conversation continues normally. People nod. Someone responds. The topic moves forward. But inside, your attention has already stopped following the story. A small hesitation appears, like a piano note played slightly off-key in a quiet room. No one else reacts. No one else seems to notice. But something in the interaction no longer feels completely aligned. And you cannot explain why yet. Some people sense this change long before they can explain it. This moment happens more often to INxx types than they usually admit. Because before language appears, their cognitive functions have already started working. A signal appears first. Explanation arrives later. Sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours later. But in that small delay between perception and language, confusion grows. You only know one thing: something didn't fully fit. At first, it doesn't look like anything. Just a pause. Maybe you look away for a moment. Maybe your expression becomes slightly distant. The other person keeps talking. They assume the conversation is flowing normally. But internally, something has already begun. A quiet scan of the situation. Not emotional reaction yet. Not deliberate logical analysis either. Just a subtle disturbance in perception. And for INxx types, that disturbance comes from different cognitive dynamics. They may all notice the shift, but why they notice it is very different. For an INTJ, the disturbance usually begins with NITE. Their mind is not primarily tracking emotional tone or social cues. It is tracking the trajectory of reasoning. NI has already started mapping the conversation as a developing pattern, where the story appears to be going, what conclusions the statements imply, how the ideas connect over time. Then suddenly something interrupts that trajectory. Not loudly, just a small inconsistency, a detail that doesn't quite match the direction the reasoning seemed to follow. NI notices the disturbance first, not as a clear thought, but as a disruption in the pattern. Then TE wants clarification. But clarification isn't available yet. The information feels incomplete. So the INTJ becomes quiet, not because they lost interest, but because their internal model is recalibrating. In the background, FI quietly checks whether the situation still feels internally coherent, while SE, the inferior function, remains attentive to concrete details that might confirm or challenge the emerging pattern. For an INFJ, the disturbance usually feels very different. Their NI still notices patterns. But the patterns it tracks often involve psychological and relational signals. Through NIFE, the INFJ observes how people express themselves and how those expressions interact with the emotional atmosphere around them. So when the shift happens, the INFJ may not first notice the literal content. They notice something subtler, a mismatch between expression and emotional intent. A reassurance that sounds calm but changes the emotional tone of the room. A smile that appears slightly delayed. A sentence that seems supportive but carries quiet tension underneath. FE registers that the relational field has shifted, but the explanation is not immediately clear. So the INFJ pauses because something in the emotional pattern stopped aligning. In the background, TI may begin quietly analyzing whether the statements themselves are internally consistent, while SE, the inferior function, momentarily sharpens attention to physical cues that might reveal what is really happening. For an INFP, the fracture is often quieter but internally distinct. Their perception moves through FINE. FI continuously evaluates whether something aligns with their internal sense of authenticity and personal meaning, not socially, not strategically, but personally. During the conversation, FI may notice something subtle, a value statement that feels slightly inconsistent, a moral position that shifts compared to what the person expressed earlier, or words that don't fully resonate with the values they seem to express. But FI does not immediately produce arguments. It produces a feeling, a quiet sense of value dissonance. Something inside doesn't resonate. Then NE begins exploring possibilities. Maybe the person meant something different. Maybe the context changed. Maybe there is another interpretation, but the unease remains. For an INTP, the interruption usually comes from TINE. Their mind follows the internal structure of ideas. Every statement forms part of a conceptual system, and TI continuously checks whether that system remains internally consistent. So during the conversation, something small disrupts that structure. Not emotionally, not socially, logically. A claim contradicts an earlier premise. An explanation skips a necessary step. Or a conclusion appears without the reasoning that should support it. Most people continue listening without noticing. But TI registers the inconsistency almost immediately. The mind pauses because the internal model no longer fits the information being presented. Then NE begins generating alternative interpretations. Maybe the person misspoke. Maybe context is missing. Maybe the argument simply isn't very strong. Meanwhile, SI may compare the statement with previously stored knowledge, while FE, the inferior function, remains aware of the social question of whether or how it would even be appropriate to point out the inconsistency. From the outside, these moments look almost identical. A brief pause in conversation, a distant look, a slight delay before responding. But internally, very different cognitive processes may be unfolding. INTJ, NI noticing a disruption in the pattern of reasoning. INFJ, NIFE sensing a shift in the relational atmosphere. INFP, FI registering value dissonance. INTP, TI detecting a logical inconsistency. Different signals, but often the same outward reaction: silence. Sometimes the dissonance is incredibly subtle. And this is where things become complicated, because detection happens first and explanation comes later, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours later, occasionally days later. You leave the conversation. Everything seemed normal, no conflict, no obvious problem. But the feeling remains. Something was slightly off. Your mind starts replaying the interaction sentence by sentence, expression by expression. Eventually, the realization appears. That statement contradicted what they said earlier. That reassurance didn't match the emotional tone. That value shifted halfway through the discussion. That explanation skipped an important logical step. The pattern becomes clearer, but by then the moment has already passed. This is one of the quiet paradoxes many INxx types experience. Their cognitive processes often detect possible inconsistencies early, but language arrives later. So in real time, they hesitate. They cannot always immediately explain why something feels off. They only know that something might not align yet. And in fast conversations, that hesitation can look unusual. Other people respond quickly and follow the flow of interaction. But the INxx mind sometimes pauses longer because once a potential fracture appears, it becomes difficult not to examine it. There is also an uncomfortable truth hidden inside this sensitivity. Detection is not the same as understanding, and it is definitely not the same as being correct. Sometimes the misalignment is real. Sometimes it is a misunderstanding. Sometimes the inconsistency belongs to the other person. Sometimes it belongs to the INxx themselves. Because when perception becomes highly sensitive to inconsistencies, it can begin noticing them everywhere. A small tone change may feel suspicious. A minor logical gap may seem larger than it actually is. A slight value difference may feel like a deeper conflict. And slowly conversations can start feeling more fragile than they really are. This is the tension hidden behind that quiet pause in conversation. The moment when attention briefly stops listening because something didn't fully align. For INTJ, the system sensed a disruption in the pattern. For INFJ, the relational atmosphere shifted. For INFP, a value felt internally inconsistent. For INTP, the logic no longer held together. Different signals. The same silence. And the other person usually never knows it happened. The conversation continues. The topic moves forward. Everyone assumes everything was understood. But the INxx mind is still somewhere in that earlier sentence, trying to reconstruct the moment when the pattern slipped. Trying to understand whether the misalignment was real or whether the mind was searching for something conversations rarely provide. Not everyone talks about this moment, but many have quietly experienced it.